Australia has to take some responsibility. If Glasgow doesn't live up to expectations, and that's likely, Australia will have helped wreck Glasgow because it didn't come with a midterm target. It actually came with plans to expand fossil fuel development. And of course, that's bad for the planet, but it's also bad for Australia's standing and our diplomacy generally.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today our guest is coming to you live from Glasgow, where COP26 is underway and where Scott Morrison is having one of the worst overseas trips for any Prime Minister in recent history.
At the G20, a not-so-happy family photo, with one Prime Minister feeling a bit left out. Scott Morrison looking around for anyone to talk to.
Relations between Australia and France have hit a shocking new low.
It's a diplomatic stoush that Australia really could well avoid.
The French president has accused Scott Morrison of lying over the cancelled $90 billion submarine deal.
For one national leader to accuse another of lying is practically unheard of at this level.
We didn't steal an island. We didn't deface the Eiffel Tower.
A text message leaked overnight appears to suggest Mr Macron was aware the deal was in danger.
I'm not going to cop sledging of Australia. I'm not going to cop that on behalf of other Australians. I can deal with whatever people throw at me.
Scott Morrison's reputation is on the line, but the biggest story is the future of humanity, which is at stake at COP26.
For those who have eyes to see, for those who have ears to listen, and for those who have a heart to feel, 1.5 is what we need to survive. 2 degrees, yes, SG, is a death sentence for the people of Antigua and Barbuda, for the people of the Maldives, for the people of Dominica and Fiji, for the people of Kenya and Mozambique, and yes, for the people of Samoa and Barbados.
So the stakes are high, and joining us now to talk about it is Ben Oakwest, Executive Director of the Australia Institute. He was in Rome, where the recent G20 meeting was held, before he too has headed to Glasgow for COP26, and that's where he's joining us from now. G'day, Ben. Thanks for getting up early.
Yeah, good morning, Ebony, and good evening to you, and hello to the listeners. It's nice to be talking to you from Glasgow, where it's miserable and cold, following on a beautiful trip to Rome, where Rome was as beautiful and sunny as you can imagine.
Well, that sounds lovely, especially to those of us who haven't been able to travel anywhere in quite some time. Ben, the Prime Minister has been travelling, but he's not having as good a trip as he might have hoped, to say the least.
Yeah, unprecedented really, Ebony. The diplomatic fallout from the subs deal with France, or the cancelling of the subs deal with France, continues. Macron really took aim at the Prime Minister after the US President threw Scott Morrison under the bus by suggesting that he thought that the US President thought that the French had been kept informed about the cancelling of the subs deal.
What happened was, to use an English phrase, what we did was clumsy. It was not done with a lot of grace. I was under the impression that France had been informed long before.
And then Macron, on the sidelines of the G20 event, did accuse Scott Morrison of lying.
With his value.
Do you think he lied to you?
I don't think. I know.
Really unprecedented. It's completely overwhelmed the whole trip. And one of the most disastrous overseas trips by a Prime Minister in recent memories, as many people have said, unprecedented. And it's really overwhelmed the whole trip, and even the Prime Minister, who made a speech to the whole world at the United Nations Conference of the Parties, the Climate Change COP in Glasgow.
As you say, unprecedented. It's kind of making me cringe just thinking about it. But you've got the President of the United States who's basically said Scott Morrison handled this thing really clumsily. And then the President of France, very influential in the EU, calling him a liar. Like, I just can't think of anything that even comes anywhere near this in terms of being a diplomatic disaster.
No, I mean, normally when a Prime Minister travels overseas, there's a lot of talk about how he's performed well on the world stage. It becomes a bit of a Team Australia moment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it simply has overwhelmed the trip. And, you know, there was some speculation that the Prime Minister wouldn't go to Glasgow, as you remember, and that thought was that he didn't really want to go. I think really...
Probably wishing he hadn't right now.
I absolutely think so, Ebony. I think there's no doubt about it. And he'll be thinking, I should have trusted my instincts not to have gone. But the reality is Australia lives in the world, doesn't it? And Australia was under enormous diplomatic pressure. And from Australia's closest allies, the United States, Joe Biden, who's really been pushing for more climate change and more climate change action in a foreign policy sense, with the employment of John Kerry as the kind of global envoy on climate change. And of course, Boris Johnson and the United Kingdom hosting the COP, desperate to make it a success, have been on a kind of foreign policy tour de force around the world, trying to ratchet up pressure on other leaders like Australia to take more ambition, to come to Glasgow. You know, the Queen, Prince Charles, everyone's been calling for leaders to come to Glasgow. And in a sense, Morrison couldn't resist that diplomatic pressure from our closest allies, of course, to go. So he kind of had to go for I think, mostly kind of foreign policy and diplomatic reasons, the Australian community as well. So he had to go because of that. And it underscores, some people think foreign policy doesn't matter, or, how does that relate to things on the ground in Australia? But Australia's closest allies were demanding Australia turn up with action on climate change, and so he had to. But I think you're right, Ebony, he'll be really wishing he didn't go, because it's not only made him look bad on the world stage, something more important has probably happened for him in terms of domestic political consequences. His reputation as being truthful and to be trusted, and that's what Macron has said, he can't be trusted. And if that idea that you can't be trusted takes hold in a domestic political sense, it's very, very dangerous on the eve of an election.
It's important that Australians have a leader on the world stage who is trusted on that stage.
And I think for us to lower the tone by leaking private text messages, really, and I'm concerned that the rest of the world will look at Australia and say, now, can Australia be trusted on contracts, not to leak private messages?
He did very elaborately and duplicitously deceive France. We had a relationship of the deepest trust and confidence with France.
Yeah, I want to come to COP, obviously, as the big news of the moment and where the highest stakes are, but it really has kind of overshadowed the G20.
After meeting in Rome, G20 countries pledged to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, but they didn't sign up to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The UN had urged them to agree on phasing out coal, but the proposal was strongly opposed by several countries, including Australia, India, China and Russia.
I don't know, it might be different. You were there, Ben, but it seemed like a bit of a fizzer. Not much came out of it that seemed very tangible.
Yes, I think that there were hopes, certainly from Boris Johnson and others, that there would be more action in particular on climate change in the lead up to the COP, and that there would be a stronger statement from the G20. Unfortunately, both Russia and China were no-shows at the G20, their leaders anyway, and their leaders again a no-show at the COP. And so that the text was watered down from what was originally drafted. You never quite know by whom and for what reasons, but by all accounts, China and Russia didn't want, or India didn't want stronger language on emissions reduction targets. But Australia too, resisting a push by the US, by Britain and others to put firm dates on the closure of coal and the phase out of coal. So Australia, I think, has also been part of weakening language, particularly when it comes to coal in relation to the G20 and also now at the COP.
Yeah.
The time for words has now moved to the time for action.
The real question is whether you have the political will to do the right thing. We are not drowning, we are fighting.
It's not 2030 or 2050.
It's now.
And all those promises will be nothing but blah, blah, blah.
We say no more blah, blah, blah. No more exploitation of people and nature and the planet. No more exploitation. No more blah, blah, blah. No more whatever the fuck they're doing inside there.
So coming to the COP now in Glasgow, there's been a huge build-up. Obviously, it was put off during the pandemic, so there's been a long time to prepare for it and expectations are quite high. But after all the fanfare with the Nationals and getting that deal over the line domestically, Scott Morrison didn't really have a lot to bring to the table when he got there, did he?
No, he didn't. And why that matters so much at this COP is this COP was meant to be a delivery COP. 6 years on from Paris, that set the goals, hopefully limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. This COP was meant to deliver on that, to make that a reality. What Joe Biden called the decisive decade, how to cut emissions this decade that would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And countries were meant to come with more ambitious targets to deliver that. That's what it was about, ratcheting up the commitments for people to meet the Paris goals, this delivery COP. But essentially, when it came to that, the Australian Prime Minister arrived empty-handed. Yes, been a net zero by 2050 goal, but really that's taken as a given from developed countries. Everybody's moved on from that. Australia arriving with no medium-term target for 2030, and worse still probably, arriving with massive plans to expand fossil fuel development in Australia, the Adani coal mine, the 20 new proposed coal mines in New South Wales, the huge gas fields across Australia that by some accounts would be, if the emissions from that were included, would be equivalent to 46 new coal-fired power stations. So Australia arrives with no short-term target, massive plans to expand fossil fuels, when this COP was meant to be about getting off fossil fuels, and in particular, Britain, who's been leading this campaign to consign coal to history, and the UN Secretary-General, who says developed countries need to end coal power this decade. In that context, Morrison has arrived very, very empty-handed, and worse, actually dragging back proposed action on climate change.
Driving down the cost of technology and enabling it to be adopted at scale is at the core of the Australian way to reach our target of net zero emissions by 2050 that we are committing to at this COP26.
What Australia continues to do, which in my book is nothing other than to dig into dark holes of poison for itself and for the planet, is completely irresponsible.
The United States will be able to meet the ambitious target I set in the Leaders' Summit in Climate back in April, reducing U.S. emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030.
It really struck me, I've been watching a lot of the media coming out of the COP, and there was a BBC reporter challenging the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the opening of one new coal mine in the UK, and he was just appalled and really challenging Boris Johnson on how can you ask India and China to be phasing out coal when you won't even rule this out. And that's just one coal mine.
No, I'm sorry to bang on about the coal, but the point is you kind of, it makes you look a little bit weaselly not answering the coal question, because they're going to go and you're talking about coal.
I've answered the coal question, and
directly,
they understand that.
Directly.
And let me tell you directly,
okay.
we are...
Yes or no on the coal mine? You personally, what do you reckon?
I'm not in favour of more coal, let's be absolutely clear, but it's not a decision for me, it's a decision for local planning authorities, right?
As you said, Australia's looking at 20 new coal mines in New South Wales alone. I mean, it's just miles away from where the rest of the world seems to be.
Yeah, it was a fascinating interview, wasn't it? Worth your our listeners having a look at it on YouTube, because Boris Johnson, of course, has led a government that's put into place serious emission reduction targets, big midterm targets. But really being hammered for just the potential of one new coal mine, just the potential of one, when Australia's got massive coal developments. Just think about the Adani mine, or on the eve of exporting the first coal from opening up the huge Galilee Basin, let alone the gas field. So quite a contrast there. Interestingly, Ebony, as somebody's pointed out to me at this COP, Australia's got half the population of Britain, less than half, yet we've got more emissions, just if you count our emissions from burning fossil fuels in the country, let alone our export emissions, than Great Britain. So I think that the debate's very, very different in Australia. It's very, very disconnected from the global reality and also disconnected from what's actually happening on the ground in Australia. I think people think, well, Australia's not that big a country. Well, we've actually got the economy the size of Russia, and we're the third largest fossil fuel exporter on the planet, one of the largest exporters, top 1 or 2 in coal, top 1 or 2 in LNG. We're a middle power, as I said, the economy the size of Russia. So we are an important global player. And what Australia does do matters for climate change. And I think that's why these conferences matter a lot to Australia, because they do put diplomatic and foreign policy pressure on the country.
Yeah, and it really struck me, Ben, the focus on fossil fuels at this COP seems to me to be unprecedented. At Paris, the Australia Institute tried really hard to back the Pacific leaders' call for a moratorium on new coal mines, but it was really hard. That was quite a new message at the time, to think about the supply side of things. This time around, you've got the UK trying to phase out coal-fired power and coal mining. You've got the President of the United States trying to push this plan for a commitment to reduce methane emissions from gas and other things by 30% by 2030. Like, the focus seems to have shifted quite dramatically.
Yes. As I said, the UK president of the COP, Alex Sharma, is calling for coal to be consigned to history. And Guterres, the UN Secretary General, is saying we've got to end it in the next 2 decades and end it for developed countries this decade. Coal, that is. It's just language you don't hear from Australian Prime Ministers, and it's quite stark, that contrast, when you hear in COP, hearing that kind of language so normalised now. You're right, Eb, compared to 6 years ago. Yeah. Really has moved fast, because the science has moved fast. And methane, I was struck by this yesterday, Eb. It was at the Australian government, of course, has a pavilion there where they show off their technologies and how much they're doing. Actually watched the Prime Minister's speech to the COP at that pavilion. Right next door to the Australian pavilion, there's a big pavilion about methane. Now, it's not about promoting methane, it's about ending methane. But, Australia, of course, has completely resisted any calls to take strong, decisive action on reducing methane, which is, after all, a much more potent greenhouse gas, lasts less long in the atmosphere, but very, very damaging, in particular this decade, when we need to turn things around. We need to get off methane fast to give us a bit more breathing room. Anyway, the contrast over how Australia talks about fossil fuels and methane and coal and gas compared to what's being said, particularly from the host country, Britain, is stark, as you say.
Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We face a stark choice. Either we stop it or it stops us. And it's time to say enough.
If we keep burning fossil fuels, we'll fry the planet. Fact. Everyone knows that. And the denying it and waffling about it and talking about, technologies and all that stuff is not going to get you around that problem.
Ben, I know that you're there on the ground at COP. There'll be a lot of our listeners who've never been there and probably never will get to a COP. Can you just paint us a little bit of a picture about what it's like to be there and what kind of a reputation Australia has there at the moment?
Well, Australia's reputation is very mixed. Well, I'll paint you a quick picture, Eb. It's in Glasgow. Glasgow is maybe just as how many listeners might imagine it. Pretty grey, pretty grim, pretty cold. Often big queues to get in the COP. There's some 20,000 people who are registered to get in there, and the place can only handle 10,000 at once. Massive queues of delegates trying to get in there yesterday. But really a sprawling network of rooms, press conferences, meetings, let alone the plenary where the leaders are making their statements, a huge array of global media, and just really an impossibility to really get a handle of exactly what's going on in the whole conference centre all the time. But in a sense, these meetings are kind of confidence games. It's about bringing the world together so that you instill a confidence that you won't be left in the lurch if you take action on climate change. It's meant to be a virtuous circle of everyone coming together and feeling that they won't be left behind if they go first, and they certainly don't want to be left behind by going last. So they're really an attempt to build confidence amongst all nations and ratchet up pressure. Unfortunately, though, circling back to the beginning and your point about expectations being high, there is going to be an enormous gap between what is needed to reach those Paris goals of limiting temperatures to 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees versus what commitments countries are actually coming forward with. And while there's some movement from India yesterday, and they've committed to net zero, albeit by 2070, and Brazil, some medium-term targets from Brazil that need a bit more interrogation. So there is some movement there. That's good, but it's not going to be enough, and Glasgow is not going to live up to expectations. And on that front, Australia has to take some responsibility. It has helped. If Glasgow doesn't live up to expectations, and that's likely, Australia will have helped wreck Glasgow because it didn't come with a midterm target. It actually came with plans to expand fossil fuel development, and that reputation is following Australia and Scott Morrison, who, circle back to the beginning, was already under big diplomatic pressure and looked bad on the international stage. And what Australia has done here at Glasgow is simply going to make that a lot worse. And of course, that's bad for the planet, but it's also bad for Australia's standing and our diplomacy generally.
Yeah, look, Ben, just before I let you go, talking about Australia's reputation and the role that it plays at these global COPs, Australia Institute supporters, we've had a massive response to help support putting some full-page ads in a Roman paper to greet Scott Morrison when he got to Rome, and in Scottish papers when he got to Glasgow. What were some of the key messages, and why did you think it was important to take out those ads as Scott Morrison arrived there?
Yeah, well, a massive shout out to Australian supporters who made those full page ads possible. Wherever the Prime Minister went, when he landed in Rome for the G20, there was a massive full page ad in the Italian version of the Financial Review, really alerting the world that Australia was trying to cheat on climate change, or that Australia was trying to wreck Glasgow, that it was coming along sprouting some words about wanting to tackle climate change, but actually its policies were not. Actually, it was trying to expand fossil fuels and really cheat the kind of purpose of these climate summits, which is to reduce emissions. Australia's actually transitioning into fossil fuels, not away from them, and letting world leaders know, and letting the international community know, letting the international press know that that's going on, helps put further pressure on Australia and isolate Australia, and for Australia's actions to be given less legitimacy when they push back against other countries wanting to take more action. So really significant intervention there, and hugely well received by the Australian public, who I think are frustrated to think that Scott Morrison was going to be telling a story that didn't represent what the Australian people wanted at these events. And just a shout out to everybody who's helped make those happen. And we've had a huge positive reaction to them, and they've had a big impact both in Rome and here in Glasgow. So thanks to the listeners, Ed.
Yeah, thank you. It's only the future of the planet at stake after all. So got to make those interventions where you think you can have some impact. Thanks, Ben. We better let you head off to COP and get in those big long lines to get in.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 2nd of November 2021, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, and you can donate to support our climate and energy research there as well. All those donations are tax deductible. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _NTT. Ben Oquist is at Ben Oquist, and our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, save the planet, and thanks for listening.